the United States. Every country that possesses nuclear weapons today owes the existence of those weapons, directly or indirectly, to decisions made in a laboratory complex hidden in the New Mexico desert between 1942 and 1945. The Manhattan Project was the most expensive and most secretive scientific undertaking in human history. A program that employed over 130,000 people across multiple sites, cost the equivalent of $30 billion in today's money, and was kept so completely hidden that Vice President Harry Truman did not learn of its existence until he became president following Franklin Roosevelt's death. The scientific foundation had been laid by European physicists, many of them Jewish refugees, who had fled Nazi persecution and arrived in America carrying knowledge that would reshape the world. When Germany surrendered in May 1945 without having developed a working weapon, the program's original justification evaporated, but the momentum was unstoppable. On July 16, 1945, the first nuclear device ever detonated lit up the New Mexico sky at the Trinity test site. 3 weeks later, Little Boy fell on Hiroshima, and Fat Man fell on Nagasaki. The United States had demonstrated not just that nuclear weapons worked, but that a single aircraft and a single bomb could destroy an entire city in a moment. Every subsequent nuclear program in history has been a response to that demonstration. Russia. The Soviet Union's path to nuclear weapons ran directly through American security failures, scientific espionage, and a surveillance operation that remains one of the most consequential intelligence efforts ever conducted. Soviet physicists had understood the theoretical possibility of a nuclear weapon before the war, but Stalin initially dismissed the program as insufficiently urgent. What changed his mind was a combination of intelligence reports about the Manhattan Project, filtered through a network of ideologically motivated spies embedded at Los Alamos, including Klaus Fuchs, Theodore Hall, and David Greenglass, and the shock of Hiroshima, which made the strategic necessity of a Soviet bomb impossible to ignore. The espionage network delivered detailed technical specifications that compressed the Soviet timeline by an estimated 5 years. Physicist Igor Kurchatov led the program with the full weight of the Soviet state behind him and the implicit understanding that failure was not an option Stalin would accept gracefully. On August 29, 1949, the Soviet Union detonated its first device at a test site in Kazakhstan, years earlier than American intelligence had predicted. President Truman announced the news to the American public with characteristic restraint. The nuclear monopoly that American policymakers had assumed would last a generation had lasted 4 years. The United Kingdom. Britain's nuclear program began not as an independent strategic initiative, but as a response to being shut out of the program it had helped create. British scientists had made foundational contributions to the Manhattan Project through the May-UD Committee and the subsequent Quebec Agreement, which gave Britain full access to American nuclear research. When the Atomic Energy Act of 1946 effectively ended that cooperation by prohibiting the sharing of nuclear information with any foreign power, including Britain, the decision to develop an independent deterrent became politically inevitable. Prime Minister Clement Attlee authorized the program in January 1947 in a meeting so small it was not formally minuted, and the work proceeded with a secrecy that kept most of the British cabinet uninformed for years. The scientific team, led by William Penny, worked without American assistance and largely from first principles, though intelligence gathered during the Manhattan Project years provided a foundation. On October 3, 1952, Britain detonated its first device off the coast of Western Australia aboard a ship called HMS Plym. The explosion created a radioactive crater on the seabed that remained contaminated for decades. Britain had become the world's third nuclear power, though the independent deterrent it had built would spend much of the Cold War dependent on American delivery systems. France. France's nuclear program was driven by a single overriding political conviction that a nation dependent on another country's nuclear umbrella for its security was not truly sovereign, and that true sovereignty required the ability to threaten destruction independently of any ally's permission or support. That conviction was embodied most completely by Charles de Gaulle, who returned to power in 1958 and accelerated a program that had been moving cautiously since the early 1950s. The French called their nuclear doctrine doctrine the force de frappe, the strike force, and built it around the explicit principle that France reserved the right to use nuclear weapons in its own national interest, regardless of NATO's position. On February 13, 1960, France detonated its first device in the Algerian Sahara Desert in a test called Gerboise Bleu. Algeria was still a French territory at the time, though a brutal independence war was already underway, a context that added a particular historical irony to France conducting its first nuclear test in a country it was simultaneously trying to hold by force. France subsequently withdrew from NATO's Integrated Military Command in 1966, a decision directly connected to its insistence on nuclear independence. It did not rejoin until 2009. China's nuclear program was born from a security guarantee that evaporated at precisely the moment it was most needed, and from a humiliation that Mao Zedong was determined would never be repeated. Soviet assistance had been central to the early development of the program. Soviet advisors, Soviet equipment, and Soviet technical knowledge had given the Chinese program its foundation. Then, in 1959, as the Sino-Soviet split deepened into open ideological confrontation, the Soviet Union withdrew its advisors, took their blueprints with them, and left the Chinese program to continue without outside help. Chinese scientists, many of them trained in the United States and Europe before returning home, rebuilt from what remained. The program operated under conditions of extreme secrecy and considerable hardship. Resources that might have alleviated the famine killing millions of Chinese citizens during the Great Leap Forward were directed toward the weapons program instead. On October 16, 1964, China detonated its first nuclear device at the Lop Nur test site in the Xinjiang desert. The announcement carried a political message as explicit as any military statement. China was now a nuclear power. It had achieved this without Soviet help, and it would never again be in a position where its security depended on another country's goodwill. India's relationship with nuclear weapons is one of the most politically complex in the world, shaped by a founding philosophy of nonviolence, a regional security environment of extraordinary danger, and a series of decisions made across 5 decades that the government consistently refused to fully acknowledge until it had no choice. Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru had positioned India as the moral leader of the non-aligned world and a vocal opponent of nuclear weapons, while simultaneously authorizing nuclear research that always carried the potential for weapons development. The 1962 war with China and China's subsequent nuclear test in 1964 transformed the strategic calculus entirely. India detonated its first device in May 1974 in a test it described with considerable creative license as a peaceful nuclear explosion, a framing the rest of the world received with widespread skepticism. The program then went dormant publicly for 2 decades while continuing covertly. In May 1998, India conducted 5 tests in 3 days, the Pokhran 2 series, and formally declared itself a nuclear weapons state. Pakistan responded with its own tests within weeks. The United States imposed sanctions that lasted until September 11th, changed the strategic priorities of American foreign policy entirely. Pakistan's nuclear program has a precise origin point that most historians trace to a single afternoon in January 1972, when Prime Minister Zulfikar Ali Bhutto gathered Pakistani scientists in Multan and told them he wanted a nuclear weapon within 3 years regardless of cost. The country had just lost a war with India that resulted in the creation of Bangladesh, and the humiliation of that defeat, combined with India's nuclear test 2 years later, made the program not a strategic option, but an existential imperative. The scientist who came to embody the program was Abdul Qadir Khan, a metallurgist who had been working at a uranium enrichment facility in the Netherlands and returned to Pakistan in 1975 carrying centrifuge designs he had taken without authorization. Khan built Pakistan's enrichment capability around that stolen technology and subsequently became one of the most consequential figures in nuclear proliferation history, running a private network that sold nuclear technology to North Korea, Libya, and Iran. Pakistan detonated its first confirmed weapons in May 1998 in direct response to India's tests, becoming the 7th country to develop nuclear weapons and completing a South Asian arms dynamic that has made the subcontinent one of the most dangerous nuclear flashpoints on Earth. Israel. Israel's nuclear program is unique in one specific and extraordinary way. It has never been officially confirmed. Israel maintains a policy of nuclear ambiguity, refusing to confirm or deny possession of nuclear weapons, and has sustained that position for over 50 years despite widespread international understanding that it possesses between 80 and 400 warheads. The program began in the late 1950s with French assistance, centered on a reactor facility at Dimona in the Negev desert that Israel initially described to the outside world as a textile factory. American U-2 reconnaissance flights identified it as a nuclear facility, and subsequent diplomatic pressure produced Israeli assurances that were almost certainly false. The program accelerated through the 1960s under Prime Minister Golda Meir's government. The most significant public evidence came in 1986 when Mordecai Vanunu, a former Dimona technician, provided detailed technical photographs to the Sunday Times of London, confirming the program's existence and scale. Vanunu was subsequently lured to Rome by a Mossad operative, kidnapped and sentenced to 18 years in Israeli prison, 11 of them in solitary confinement. Israel has never commented on his revelations. The ambiguity serves a specific strategic purpose. It deters adversaries without triggering the formal proliferation responses that an official declaration would require. North Korea. North Korea's path to nuclear weapons is the story of a regime that decided survival required the one capability that guaranteed no American president would ever order a conventional military strike to remove it. The program began with Soviet assistance in the 1950s and proceeded through decades of international pressure, sanctions, negotiated agreements that North Korea signed and violated, and diplomatic processes that produced documents and photographs and handshakes and nothing else of substance. The country conducted its first nuclear test on October 9, 2006, producing a yield so small that some analysts initially questioned whether it had fully succeeded. Subsequent tests in 2009, 2013, 2016, and 2017 removed all doubt. The final test in 2017 produced a yield estimated at 100 to 300 kilotons, roughly 10 to 20 times the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. North Korea simultaneously developed ballistic missile technology capable of reaching the continental United States, achieving in 2017 what analysts had been predicting for years without quite believing. The regime that had been described for decades as irrational and on the verge of collapse had methodically built the one capability that makes its removal by force too costly to seriously contemplate. And it had done so while the world watched and negotiated and imposed sanctions that changed nothing fundamental about the calculation. If you made it this far, drop a comment below and let us know which country you want us to cover next. Subscribe so you never miss an upload. There is a lot more where this came from.